Hello, my name's Matt Undy. I'm a Senior Services Architect with Okta, and you're listening to the Meet Your Okta Identity Expert podcast. This is a series of podcasts where we bring Okta's professional services experts to share their experiences and knowledge of how they've managed our customers' identity in the online world. For today's podcast, myself and Mel Holloway, an identity expert from Okta Professional Services, are going to speak about compliance and how compliance relates to identity and access management. Before we start, a quick disclaimer. Because this podcast includes discussion around compliance and certain legal concepts, we need to remind our listeners that the podcast does not constitute legal advice and is provided for informational purposes only. If you or your organisation need specific legal or compliance advice, be sure to discuss that with your legal and compliance teams. With that, I'd like to introduce Mel Holloway. Mel, thank you for joining us today. Could you introduce yourself and tell us why you enjoy working at Okta and what makes you a compliance guru?
Great, thanks, Matt. So, guru, that's a big word. I'm not sure whether I agree with that. Let's go for compliance expert. Let's start there. So I've been at Okta around about 4.5 years now, with the responsibility of building up and managing the European professional services team. So a bit about my background. Originally after school I joined up, so I've got a military background, the army, the only service to be in. But so from a security point of view, I've been in security since school really. After the forces, I've got a broad background, predominantly in infrastructure, Windows, messaging, firewalls and just general security. An opportunity came up around about 15 years ago to move to a specialist, at the time, an integrity partner, deploying identity and access manager. I stayed there in the identity space for around about 7 or 8 years before I moved to an organisation called Vayu. Vayu was a specialist for governance, risk and compliance, and this really got me into the whole compliance space, looking at roles and identity attestation. Post that, I moved on to Sun, and then that was acquired by Oracle. So I've got a proven background in identity, but also a proven background in compliance and the whole digital identity landscape. And it's not just at a technical level, but also at a commercial level. So I acknowledge the trade-offs between confidentiality, integrity and availability. So the kind of CISP tenets, if you like, and understand the business acumen and the challenges with trading off one against the other. But I think back to your original question when you spoke about what do I really enjoy about Okta, I think lots of things about Okta which are really great. Firstly, it's not one of these monolithic giants which are stuck in the way they are. We're a very agile organisation and we double down and really do specialise in the whole identity landscape. So it's a great place to be. That enough about me, although I could talk about that forever and a day, Matt. How about you? How does your experience relate to compliance? And what is it that you also love about Okta?
Thanks, Mel. As I said, I'm a Senior Services Architect in the Okta team in EMEA. I'm based in the UK. I've worked in professional services and in identity and access management for 12 years now, and I've been at Okta for 2.5 years. Before Okta, I worked for a specialist IAM consultancy and then for one of the big on-premises IAM vendors. That gave me the opportunity to work with many different IAM solutions and products and for a wide variety of customers. This has let me see how different regulations affect customers in different industries, and I've had to gain awareness of those regulations to enable me to design solutions. In some of my past projects, this has included designing identity governance and administration solutions, role and entitled management solutions, and helping customers to define their IAM strategies. And this has been in both government departments and in the public sector. I enjoy working at Okta because projects are so quick compared to traditional IAM projects, and we don't have to spend lots of time building environments and designing the infrastructure, installing software. We can just get straight on with the interesting bits, creating the solutions for customers. So let's get started. Mel, tell us where compliance has been involved in some of the projects you've been working on recently.
Yeah, I think all of our projects have elements of compliance. As you'd expect from an identity provider, it's a real big part of what we do. And I think there's two areas where we're seeing huge growth for the whole compliance side of things. And this is really telling in the pharmaceutical industry, where recently we've had a number of really significant wins with global and national pharmaceutical organisations, and also within public sector organisations. And I'll come on to those in a minute. And I'll be the first person to admit that I'm not a pharma compliance expert, so I've had to do quite a lot of background work to get myself up to speed. But within the pharmaceutical industry, there's a set of compliance standards, GXP, as they're known, with the X that you can remove and replace with GMP, which is good manufacturing practices, GCP, good clinical practices, or GLP, good laboratory practices. All these are very relevant to the pharmaceutical industry. And it's been a fascinating learning curve to see how the pharmaceutical industries are applying these. And some of the more important elements of these compliance requirements. So one of the things that the compliance requirements state is you must be working to a project management methodology. Great, that's a big tick in the box for us here at Okta, because not only do we use Prince 2 methodology, but also deploying projects using Agile or Waterfall. And then there's also compliance for computerized standards. And again, another tick in the box for us at Okta, because we use consistent documentation and diagrams, and all this is readily available to be shared with customers. And we've also got things like encryption standards that come into it. And you'll see within our product, there's a number of places where we apply encryption standards. And then we've got disaster recovery. And the way our architecture is set up with our resilient data centers between the US and here, and then even more so within the EU across Frankfurt and Dublin, we offer this 24/7, 365 fully resilient service. So these are all things which are kind of run rate and all part of the compliance standard. But then we get into the more interesting parts from my point of view, where I consider our expertise lies, is really once we start talking about access management and identity verification that the compliance standards require. And also elements of multi-factor authentication that we'll probably cover that later, so I won't dive down into that in too much detail. But it's fair to say when we look at the pharmaceutical industry, we, from a compliance point of view, we're not a silver bullet, we're not going to fix everything, but there's a number of different components that we can help out on from a compliance point of view. And the other sector I mentioned, Matt, which is really strange as well and really coming towards the cloud now, is within the public sector. Again, over the last 12 months, we're seeing a huge amount of traction, and the public sector are now starting to move away from what was their traditional on-prem way of thinking and their modus operandi to more of a cloud-based infrastructure, which is just absolutely awesome for us. And when I look at compliance there, we're talking things like BS 7799, morphed itself again, ISO 27001. And to move from premise to the cloud is absolutely no small feat. And if I look at both of those compliance standards, there's a number of different controls, hundreds of controls in there that we can help these organisations with. And considering that they're risk adverse with small IT departments, moving to the cloud and really breaking that traditional model. So for us to be involved with these organisations, not just helping them on their digital identity journey, but also helping them from a cloud and compliance point of view is just fantastic. So that said, talk about those two sectors, the pharmaceutical and the public sector. What about yourself, Matt? What have you seen affecting your customers from a compliance point of view recently?
Yeah, I've been working for several financial services organisations recently, designing new solutions, for example, for companies that are involved in fund management. And these companies provide systems for both their customers and for financial advisors. This brings in a few of the regulations, most notably Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX and PCI DSS. As our listeners probably know, SOX was introduced a number of years ago in the wake of the Enron scandal to make corporate practices more transparent. And it includes elements like fraud reduction and compliance auditing. And IAM can help with this by helping to control access to data and reducing the risk of compliance violations. For example, using lifecycle management and provisioning. Situations like changes in permissions when job duties change, or even when there's a termination, can be handled very quickly using IAM. And when we look at PCI DSS, the data security standard for the payment card industry, this was a standard that came up from all of the different credit card companies having their own standard and trying to create one unified standard for the industry. And again, IAM can be an important part of the solution. It can help to implement least privilege access, prevent separation of duties violations, and also prevent unnecessary escalation of privileges. So now, the big one that everyone's thinking about at the moment, especially in the EU, is GDPR. And we know GDPR is going to start being enforced on the 25th of May 2018. How have you seen this affecting our customers so far?
That is an absolutely great question, Matt. And GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is really a hot topic, not just across EMEA and Europe, as you mentioned, but it's something global that we all need to be aware of. Maybe I can allude to that in a bit more detail, but it feels and looks very different to everything that's gone before it. The other compliance standards, and you mentioned SOX and PCI, there was always talk about organisations being fined and punished in some way for not being compliant, and really it's hard to find anybody that's been punished for that. And now when you look at GDPR, I think there is a real drive and it seems to have teeth, and I do absolutely believe that it is going to be enforced and organisations are going to be fined for not being GDPR compliant. So when I look at that whole compliance standard, and it's a bit of an animal, it's not the smallest standard in the world and it's really complex and there's lots of confusion. But when I apply my Okta hat and look at it from an Okta lens, there's a number of different areas where I look and we can double down and help. So firstly, the GDPR applies to any global entity, as I mentioned, and size isn't necessarily differentiated as well. The smallest organisations, your mom and pops, if you've got identity data, it matters to your largest organisations who will definitely have that kind of data. But it's those entities that collect, store or process personal data of EU individuals. And that's where, again, the confusion comes up, because EU individuals are also stored across at our colleagues in the US. So you look at Amazon and Facebook and Spotify and all these different organisations that store some kind of profile and identity data. GDPR matters to these guys in a big way. And it classifies these entities in a number of different ways. Firstly, as data controllers or data processors. Speaking broadly, those categories can be defined, if you look at it as a data controller, this is the thing that exercises control over the processing of personal data and decides which data to be collected. And then you've got the data processor, which again, slightly different to the data controller. This is where people start getting a bit confused. That acts as a direction of data controller to collect, store, retrieve, or delete personal data. And delete it is the kind of big buzzword here. But when I look at it from Okta as a vendor and look at it from our context, Okta is considered to be the data processor under GDPR, while our customers are obviously the data controllers. But either way, whether you're Okta, whether you're a customer, everybody is going to be affected with GDPR. We are all in this together.
And I know GDPR has been a huge topic inside Okta as well. It's been really interesting to hear all of the work that's been done in the different departments like legal, IT and product to make sure that the service we provide to our customers is GDPR compliant. And I think the agility that's possible with us being a cloud service has been really useful in supporting this. And it's somewhere I think traditional IAM systems may have problems getting ready to support it. For example, as you mentioned, deleting or the right to be forgotten, Okta have been working so that if this is required, the user data can be removed from the current version and also from the backups, so there's no remnant of that user's data in any of the backups as well. And another key tenet is being able to retrieve user data in a standard format. And Okta has RESTful APIs that allow user data to be retrieved when required in a standard JSON format. Another key tenet is being able to retrieve user data in a standard format. And Okta have RESTful APIs that allow user data to be retrieved when required in a standard JSON format, which addresses that. And as well as those, Okta's commitment to ensuring that data is secure is also key. And we've achieved a number of certifications that attest to how important data security is to Okta. And these include SOC 2 Type 2, CSA Star, ISO 27001, and ISO 27018. And these attest to how we manage data across the entire production environment, how we develop and release code, and how we respond to incidents and recovery in the event that there is a problem in the data center. We know that GDPR compliance can be a major undertaking, but Okta can help to consolidate a business's identities and provide greater visibility into their identity data. With Okta, you can easily find users in the Universal Directory and see which applications that have been provisioned through Okta they have access to, what entitlements they've got in the target applications, and even which data they can access, if you can map that all back to those application assignments. And that provides a good starting point for locating their personally identifiable information. The Okta platform helps both individual users and large enterprises to ensure that they're complying with GDPR requirements. Mel, there are also several regulations in the US which we don't see much over here that Okta have been doing a lot of work on over the past few years. Could you speak a little bit about those and how Okta can help?
Yeah, again, my expertise over the last few years has not been in these, but with my US colleagues and with my previous experience, just looking at some of the regulatory requirements there that don't necessarily affect us here in Europe, one of the top of mind is HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. Really important there, very similar to our data records, which are held in the NHS. But that gives users, it's their identity, it's their data, with an opt-in, opt-out process that they may or may not exercise. And Okta deals with this in a number of different ways. So we talk about having a multi-tenant environment, and that's one of the unique points about Okta. But there we have separate concept of separate cells. We spoke about separate data centers. I remember I spoke about Frankfurt and Dublin. But we also have the concept of separate cells within those data centers. And what this allows us to do, when there's certain compliance regulations, such as HIPAA, to stand up dedicated hardware at a different data encryption level to support that compliance standard. And then we can look at things like high tech as well, which also applies to the US. And FedRAMP is another one that's now very similar to our own public sector here in EMEA, that's gaining traction. But it allows us to separate out that data from what might be your normal mom and pop shop to what might be the Ministry of Defence or one of the defence organisations that demand their data is held at a higher level.
Thanks, Mel. So we've discussed that having an IAM solution is a key component allowing companies to achieve regulatory compliance. I'd like us to discuss a few areas in particular where IAM can help with many of the regulations. Mel, why don't you go first?
Yeah, good point there. So when we talk about IAM, we're talking about identity and access management, so as the complete package. But looking at one of the customers I've been working with recently, deploying single sign-on. This was at Gatwick Airport. For those not in the know, Gatwick is a globally the second biggest single runway airport, which is quite a mouthful, but that's something that they really do wave the flag about. But there, when we deployed single sign-on, it was to allow users to have a single set of credentials, but get into multiple applications across the entire organisation. And we worked really, really closely with the security team there at Gatwick, and that was all about meeting their own internal security and audit standards. And what they were trying to do was reduce the whole identity sprawl. So that stops people having different identities and different passwords in different applications, but have that single point of control to provide a single source of the truth for employees across the entire organisation. And that leads back, Matt, to what you were saying before about the right to be forgotten. When you've got that right to be forgotten, if you can go to one place and delete that user's identity and have that propagated, rather than going to 10 or 15 different systems, that makes things a lot easier. So that's me with Gatwick and single sign-on. What about yourself?
Yeah, a key area where I think IAM can help, as I mentioned earlier, is through lifecycle management and automating the join and mover and leaver process for users as much as possible. And this can include directly integrating IAM with the HR system to ensure that data is more up-to-date, accurate, and consistent. And through provisioning, that data can then flow to each connected system, making sure that all data throughout the systems in the organization is up-to-date and accurate. And this can ensure that situations like role changes and terminations are handled appropriately and quickly, and ensure things like separation of duties and stopping permission creep as users change roles throughout their career. Using a central provisioning system also provides visibility into which users have access to which applications and possibly even which entitlements they have in those systems. And again, this is a very important element of compliance to many of the regulations, and it allows you to build a holistic map of who has access to data. Some examples of where we've done this at our customers. One customer is Eurostar, where we implemented lifecycle management to provision and deprovision access to applications to ensure that employees can get access to the data that they need when they need it. And this was particularly used for health and safety information for the drivers of the Eurostar trains. And another is Undy, which is a large energy company. And there we implemented lifecycle management to do AD domain consolidation, consolidating users from over 100 AD domains and then provisioning accounts into an additional domain to give them access to data and to applications. And although these projects were done before GDPR was being enforced, the IAM solution will still be an important part of addressing it. And for GDPR, this can be a huge help with the right to be forgotten, with automated deprovisioning for a user deleted in the IAM system can be automatically deleted in every connected system, helping to ensure that personally identifiable information is removed from all systems. So Mel, are there any other areas where you think IAM can help?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. So when we look at identity and access management, we tend to look at the front end of things, and just taking a step back and looking at the back end repository. And then we can start looking at directory consolidation. And you just mentioned what we did for Undy to bring all that Active Directories together. But it doesn't necessarily need to be Active Directory. It's any kind of user repository can be consolidated into Okta's Universal Directory. And that way it just gives you that single port of reference for all user profile information. And another one that we shouldn't downplay is our ability to provide multi-factor authentication and adaptive MFA. So this is providing two-factor authentication, so it's not just anymore the user's username and their password, but it's taking that a step further really, and then looking at something that they also have. So that might be a PIN code on a mobile number as an example. And when we look at the adaptive side, it's how does that fit in with compliance? Well, not only are we doing the two-factor, but when we start looking at adaptive MFA, we can start being a lot more clever. So that is to say, if you log on at 9 o'clock in the morning in the Netherlands, it's pretty much impossible for you to log on at 10 o'clock in New York because you just couldn't have done that. So by having a really comprehensive rules engine, we can look at your authentication, your last authentication event, and compare that against your next authentication event, and then deny or allow. And also, using that same rule engine, we can start applying different policies, whether you're inside the office or outside the office. Or you might be in a high-risk country, as an example. You might be in one of the countries where we don't necessarily want data to travel to, and we can stop you doing that. So these are things that can really help demonstrate to auditors against a compliance standard that you are following things through and you are actioning against the standard. So it's one thing complying with the standard, but it's then another thing being able to prove it to an auditor, and having this information is just great. So that said, what about yourself, mate? Is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that IAM systems should also provide auditing for everything that we've discussed. So any changes that are made to user accounts that are provisioned into other systems, any changes that are made by administrators, like changing sign-on policies or multi-factor policies, even things like every time a user authenticates or every time there's a failed authentication of a user, it should all be audited so that you've got that audit record. And some of the regulations dictate how long you'll store that audit data for. And this data can also be used to determine who was using the systems at what time, who granted those users access to the systems, and when that access was granted, which is all important in the traceability of why that user was allowed to access data. So, in closing, Mel, I'd like to thank you for speaking with us today and sharing some of your experiences and your ideas. And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and be sure to stay tuned for another session of Meet Your Okta Identity Experts.
Thank you all.